I know that I said the next video would have more PS1 swordplay action, and well, I didn't lie, but this is partially an update to the future of Rising Zan as well as an extended coverage at the gameplay. There were a few aspects to the gameplay that I regretfully excluded from my previous video, and so I've come to rectify that. The update to Rising Zan's status will probably be close to the end of the video, so if you're more interested in what will possibly become of Zan, then you can skip to that part using this timecode, or just click on it in the description below. If you haven't seen my previous video covering Rising Zan, I suggest that you do. As well, I also suggest that you try the game out if you haven't already. You can easily emulate this game on a PC, tablet, or what have you, or you can purchase the game cheaply online. I intend to progress through this video mostly chronologically, meaning that I'll go from level to level analyzing various gameplay elements as we run into them. This is going to be your only spoiler warning, so again, I suggest that you try the game out before you watch this video. Continue at your own risk. No fancy editing this time, let's jump right into the first level. Overall, I think it's a very good introduction to the game. Your first few enemies are cannon fodder, literally at one point in this level. You start off fighting strawmen, which can be easily dispatched with a single slice. They're slow to attack, do little damage, and provide barely any threat. The game quickly steps up to green and red ninjas, both with their own attack patterns, but neither of these enemies are anything to write home about. But you will be fighting these types of enemies on and off for the rest of the game. After your first couple of green ninjas in the level, the game also introduces civilians in need of assistance. I'm actually not completely sure as to what these guys do whenever you free them, whether it's a simple moral choice or more akin to the Prisoners of War in the Metal Slug series. This game doesn't seem like the pseudo-intellectual interactive story that many modern games highly tout amongst themselves as of late, so I can almost guarantee that they're similar to Metal Slug. After this, you get to make the choice of which cannon you wish to enter to proceed to the next area. One spits you out a few meters from the cannon, one shoots you into a saloon where you fight more enemies, and the third shoots you directly into the next part of the level, skipping past the infested saloon. You fight a few more ninjas as you proceed, and then you reach this area. Here, the game presents you with an obstacle where you have to avoid fire by jumping over it, while also attacking the highlighted enemies powering the fiery carousel. I feel that this helps introduce two things. One, it helps the player by showing them that enemies, projectiles, and potential threats are all rendered on your radar. And it's typically easier to pay attention to the radar to see upcoming threats or projectiles that are out of your view. As well, there are multiple parts in the game similar to this, where you have to avoid multiple threats, traps, etc., while trying to destroy an objective. Hell, one level is basically these types of instances consecutively. This one is fairly easy, so I think it's a pretty good introduction. After this, there's a short section where the enemy boss taunts you and beckons you into a church. The church is the first of several all-button events strewn throughout the game. Many of these areas seem absurdly close to one another, and I wouldn't mind it so much if they spread them out a bit more evenly. Probably the only real thing the first level gets wrong in this section, because right after the first all-button event in the game, you have to fight the boss, and then you have another one right after you beat him. Depending on how fast you are, you'll be performing two all-button events within about 2 minutes. These instances could have been a serviceable break between combat sections, but like I said, a few of them are scattered so closely together that it can feel pretty tiring. Aside from this though, there's the first boss battle in the game. And I have to say, I think that this battle is a really great indication at what's to come. You start the fight having to use your pistol to attack the boss while dodging barrels that roll towards you, some explosive, some not. This employs the use of fending or strafing from side to side, or you can jump to dodge the oncoming barrels. After you destroy his gondola, the battle turns into a melee fight. The boss turns red, spins himself towards you, and is immune to damage during this state of fury. The sound of metal hitting metal plays if you attack him to signify this momentary invulnerability. Several other bosses throughout the game have similar invulnerabilities, although not all of them turn red. Another boss a couple of levels later turns gray like the color of stone, and several normal enemies can block shots. But they all have a specific animation to signify this, and also plays the metal on metal sound. Near the end of the game, one of the mini-bosses turns red, but he's not completely invulnerable to damage. He has an animation that plays whenever he's blocking your attacks. In retrospect, I thought it was strange to have the first boss do this, but none of the subsequent bosses behave similarly, despite looking somewhat similar. Maybe it's a way for the game to throw off players who noticed this with the first boss, or maybe it's an oversight. Other than that, the first boss is a good mix between gimmick and engagement. And again, after you beat the boss, you perform the all button event, wail on the enemy, and obtain points based off of your performance. On to the next level, and really this level is what drove me to make this follow-up video. The second level in the game is probably the hardest level, mostly because it introduces a couple of different concepts that weren't introduced earlier, so now the player isn't given the chance to become acclimated to the sudden shift in gameplay intensity. You see, level 2 is timed, and not only is it timed, but as you progress you'll also trigger sections that you can't move past until you defeat the enemies contained within those sections. One enemy type it introduces for the first time, and the second enemy it introduces for the first and last time in the game. Seriously, this guy's nowhere else in the entire game, and they do this with a multitude of enemies throughout. He could have been an interesting enemy that was presented earlier so that the player knows what to expect when fighting him, and mixing him amongst other enemy types in later levels could have proven a difficult challenge. In fact, all of the different concepts in this level should have been introduced within levels before it. I think that instead of going straight to this timed, segregated, and honestly very surprising level, the developers could have created 2 levels before this one. One level could have introduced the timer, maybe in just one section, or hell, maybe throughout the entirety of it. The following could have had sections where you're forced to defeat enemies before you can proceed, as well as introducing the red drums and the fire breathers. Section areas like this aren't used throughout the rest of the game, mostly you just move from room to room, and timers are used in one section in one level, and another time during a boss fight if you get hit in a certain way, but even in the boss fight, it's not a one-hit kill or a game over scenario. It's strange to see both of these concepts introduced full force on the second level in the game, and then they're never, if barely, touched on again. I do have a theory for this though. Rising Zan came out in a time when game rentals were still strong and ongoing. I mean, come on, it was the 90s, but I figure that this level is similar to Battletoads for the NES, where the game quickly introduces a very hard level as a smart, if not sadistic, way to combat game rentals. I think that this theory is backed up by the fact that UEP made both arcade cabinets and amusement facilities back when the company actually existed. Many arcade games ramped up the difficulty very quickly as an easy way to eat through players' quarters. After this level though, Rising Zan drops the difficulty and stays fairly consistent throughout the rest of the game. This level is fairly short though, and after you deplete the boss's health, you'll have another all button event and proceed to the next level. After the second level and its massive spike in difficulty, the game settles back down to what one might think is a normal difficulty progression. If Rising Zan's difficulty were to look like a graph, it might look something like this. And as the game progresses, it tends to follow a simple formula that goes a little something like this. 1. Introduce new enemy type. 2. Never introduce that enemy again. 3. Introduce new gimmick/minigame. 4. Fight cannon fodder. 5. Perform all button event. 6. Fight mini-boss. And 7. Fight main boss. From here on out, most of the levels will follow this basic formula with slight variations. A few levels will have more mini-bosses or more gimmicks, but they're largely the same in terms of how they're structured. I don't mean this to sound like each level is exactly the same and therefore monotonous, because it's not. A lot of the game's charm comes from what new enemy the game will thrust upon you at any given moment. Most enemies' movesets are rather simple, and most people should be able to figure out their attack patterns rather quickly, so most normal enemies are never an issue. My problem with this is that you rarely take the knowledge learned from fighting a new enemy and reapply it later on. Usually, new enemies are contained within a single level in a room or two, and each level lasts 10 to 20 minutes. I've only played a few of these types of action games. Most recently, I've been playing through Bayonetta 2, but my understanding about these action games is that enemies get introduced in a level, the game reinforces your knowledge by interspersing the enemy amongst old enemies, and then the game continues to populate later levels with that enemy amongst newer enemies. I know that Rising Zan was, in a sense, the first, if not one of the first of these types of action games, so the developer didn't have any sort of guideline to work upon. If I were a guessing man, I'd hypothesize that the developers either didn't have enough time to create more levels for these enemies, or their current model uses new enemy types as an incentive to keep people playing. See what's coming next. But I feel that Rising Zan's overindulgence on discarding new enemies has wasted gameplay potential. The developers could have recycled a lot of enemies throughout the game and created even more levels, increasing the game's playtime to longer than 2 hours. But I figured that there were probably time constraints which would have prevented this anyways, because the Japanese version of the game has even less levels than the US version. From here on out, we're going to skim through the levels and cover the juicier bits because, as I've said, the rest of the game largely follows the aforementioned list. The third level is a great example of following my previously mentioned list. You start off fighting a new enemy, the dogs who shoot Cheeto Puffs at you. The game introduces Zan's first dependence on his long jump ability. A couple of times actually. You run into these two mini-bosses which are pretty fun to fight, although it's a bit easy to learn their attack patterns. You run into these guys later and they're a bit tougher, but it's mostly the same. There's an all-button event here and it's basically the same as all the rest. There's another mini-boss after this and she's a bit tougher, because you have to fight a couple of common enemies at once while dodging her attacks. And this battle's a great use of the radar. The boss for this level is a bit of a pushover because it's easy to continually circle him and dodge all of his attacks. Most of his attacks are pretty easy to read, but more often than not, you'll just find yourself running around the guy like the eyeballs or snowman in Super Mario 64. This is the boss that shares the invincibility with the first one, although he turns into the color of stone. It's just sort of weird that this is the only boss that turns gray when blocking damage when most of the others turn red. Level 4 is the Hell Train. You start off on the caboose and make your way towards the engines. And this has been done many times in various titles, but I still think it's a fun idea. This level is filled with less enemies and more gimmicks though. There's a couple of levels like this. You fight a couple of yellow ninjas this time who excel in hand combat. They're actually kind of tough because they can jump at you quickly and attack, especially if your camera's fucked, so it's not a bad idea to block their attacks and strike whenever they're close. The next train car is a trap filled with hostages and I suppose explosives. It's optional, so you can just run right through it if you don't feel confident enough to release the prisoners. Moving on, the next car is a room with a big red button, a bunch of lasers, and a door that you have to destroy at the end. I would suggest destroying it first and then you can activate the button to make reaching the exit a little easier. Following this has you destroying 4 pillars while dodging gigantic spiked balls. It's easy enough if you know how to fend. There's another prisoner car after this, with one of the cells being occupied by a ninja disguised as a prisoner, and it seems to be random judging from multiple playthroughs. Another car with 4 pillars, dodging spiked balls, and a turret that shoots fire at you. After this you have your all-button event, which is, as usual, fairly easy. After this you go through a passenger car with what I think is the 3rd or 4th enemy in the level, depending on if you try to save the prisoners or not. He functions basically as a mini-boss, and despite his reliance on long-distance attacks, he is actually easier for me to beat at a long distance. He's nothing to write home about, although I do like his flame shorts, it reminds me of middle school. This boss is Feminist Roshi's brown sock puppet. There's a neat change in perspective for this battle, and it works really well. He does quite a bit of damage and can heal himself once you dish out damage of your own, but once again it's not too hard. Level 5 starts you off fighting with some optional red drums. It's a good way to fill your hero meter, and the red drums themselves do provide a bit of a challenge, but I usually run past them. There's another fight with a flame short sky, and after that there's a section where you destroy a few consoles while dodging the red drums. You're introduced to a new enemy that actually sees quite a bit of action in this level, the blue ninja who teleports and throws bombs at you. This guy's goddamn annoying and I hate him, so I'm partially glad that I hardly run into this asshole again after this level. There's a sort of a mini-boss segment where you dodge a blue ninja's bombs while shooting the fucking huge bomb next to him to light it, then shoot him when he attempts to put it out. I want to pause for a second and say that I really like these sections where you have to complete some minor goal before you can proceed. This one feels a little more clever than the other sections in Rising Zan, although it's still just shooting at what the game tells you to shoot at, but I think it's a serviceable break from all action all the time! And you fight some more blue ninjas. After an all-button event, there's probably my favorite part of this level, which I think makes up for the drab cave environment. Here you get to ride on a minecart while navigating through the level. The game informs you that you can speed up or slow down with the up or down on the D-pad, and you can jump with O. Strangely, the game doesn't care to mention that you can lock on and shoot at all during this section, which is both very useful and eventually necessary. As you move along the track, you can shoot levers to change the direction the cart will go, avoiding potential hazards. You eventually get to a point where you fight a fucking train. You have to dodge missiles and shoot its nostrils. After both are destroyed, the train tries to ram you, and you have to continually balance between shooting the train to hurt it or shooting the gem in its head to calm it down. It's a pretty fun fight, and I'm quite impressed that the developers could create an infinite track for you to fight on. If the fight takes a little longer, you'll notice that the whole sequence is just looped, but it's neat nonetheless. The boss of this level is a bit of a variation of the mini-boss from the third level. He teleports around, dashes towards you, and can apparently plant a bomb on you that you can defuse by attacking him? I don't get it either. It is a challenging fight though. A new enemy greets you here, the Pink Ninja. She throws knives at you by either twirling in a circle and throwing them out around her, or tossing them up in the air and then having them rain down on you. This encounter can be annoying because there's 3 here that you have to fight in total, but it can be easy because the enemies can hit one another with their knives. In the next room, you save a civilian being chased by strawmen. This can be challenging because he runs all over the damn room and the game's controls make it tough to kill the enemies while they're moving. But this area has no real consequence if you fail. The next room has light blue ninjas who fly on pencils and ram into you, and yeah, they can be annoying, but they have relatively low health. After this is an endurance challenge where you fight through multiple rooms full of enemies that is timed, and this is the only other area where you see a timer in the game. I would suggest using a bit of your hustle time to get through this area. Another all-button event with a bit of humor. Continuing on, there's a room with blue ninjas ziplining across the room throwing bombs at you, but your worst enemy will be the camera. Zipline to the next area where you fight the geisha boss. She throws fans at you, which leave trails of fire. She spins in a circle while shooting a laser beam, and she shoots triangles at you. You'll definitely want to be careful with this boss and time your jumps correctly. Now here you start off with an all-button event, which annoys me because you just finished one with the previous boss, so I wish that they had spaced it out better, but whatever. Then you fight the doll-looking thing, which is fairly easy, and the next room is the dreaded platforming section. I said it in my previous video, but the reason the platforming sucks in this game is because Zan, as well as other character models, are sometimes rendered through the geometry, as if they're in front of whatever you're looking at, even though they're supposed to be rendered behind it. So it looks like you should be right in front of the platform to drop down onto it, but you actually overshot and you land right into the electricity. As well, there's a guy here who shoots rockets at you, but he's really easy to kill. You get past this only to run into yet another annoying section filled with spinning enemies with blades on their arms, who always seem to be just out of reach for you, but can slap your shit if you're not careful. I hate it, but I'm glad that this enemy only shows up once. The next couple of rooms are a few gimmicks which range from easy to frustrating, and that seems to be this level's theme, but one room has you on a swivel where you shoot guys who shoot rockets at you while you try to not hit civilians. It's pretty easy. The adjacent room has baseball. Here you time the bombs that are thrown at you and you try to hit the target in the middle. This one, it's just a pain in the ass. Let's continue. You fight the doll again who turns into a pig and shoots Cheetos at you, yeah. Then you have a slot machine, which is a lot less luck-based than it is in real life. Whenever you shoot, the wheel always lands on the icon after the one you shot it on, so it takes a bit of memorization, but it's not too difficult. You fight the brown robot again in a normal perspective, but instead of healing, he's accompanied by rockets, which you can disable fairly quickly. He has a lot of the same attacks as before, but this time he can slam the ground and make fire flare up through the floor. It's quite hard to dodge. Level 8 is a theater level, which is my favorite visually, as well because it's basically boss fight after boss fight. And each fight is different from one another with various attacks, gimmicks, and visuals, and it's really fun. I think that this level accurately exemplifies what I like most about Rising Zan. The first boss has a bell that drops on you, much like the spike balls from earlier, then she rams at you and shoots projectiles. After this, you get a one-on-one with your clone, and it's not too hard, but it's a fun fight with humorous dialogue. The next boss really sucks. He also kind of blows. Get it, guys? Do you get it? Okay. Well, he alternates between sucking you close to him and blowing you towards an electrified area, all while shooting big purple balls at you. Yeah. It's kind of tedious but unique. You fight the twins again in this area and they're a bit tougher than before. They switch off a lot quicker and are in general harder to kill, but it's basically the same strategy as before. Next you fight Gunman, sitting in his boiling frog pot. Sure, a lot of people will like this since frogs seem to be very topical this year. He's really easy though, he just shoots lasers at you and lets you shoot him until he's dead. There's an all-button event after this with yet another mini-boss who's quite tough. He does a lot of damage, is impervious to ranged attacks, and is in general an asshole. You definitely have to time your attacks correctly or block when he's about to strike. After him you have to fight the main boss who, as I stated in my previous video, looks somewhat similar to Echidna from Devil May Cry, and has sort of a similar moveset. Here though, you attack the two generators on the sides of him and attack him when he's stunned. His only move, which is a pain in the ass, is whenever he recovers from his stun state. He drops bombs near you, which almost always seem to slap my shit. This is the last level in the game, and it's really disappointing actually. The boss fights are kind of fun, but the level in general is really a letdown. It's basically just boss fight, boss fight, boss fight, and then boss fight. Which sounds hypocritical of me because I just praised the last level because it's basically the same way. The difference here is that you fight Lokai, and then you fight him again. And then you fight one of my sperms, and then you fight him again. So it's really just two boss fights with minor variations between each segment. And after this, you've beaten the game. It's extremely anticlimactic, and I would be upset if the rest of the game wasn't quite fun. So, overall, the gameplay to Rising Zan can be quite fun, if not occasionally frustrating. But my main problem with the game isn't the general controls, which I got a hang of quite quickly, but more so the wasted potential. Rising Zan had the potential to be both a much longer and more memorable game. I feel that the developers should have created more levels, spaced out enemies, and reintroduced older enemies later on. As well, the final level was just a shitty ending to the game, so I wish it were better. I felt that the game's difficulty progression was almost just right, excluding the second level, of course. But now that we're done with the gameplay, I have a few updated and various curiosities that I would like to discuss about Rising Zan. First off, I was able to get in contact with Masaki Shimizu, Rising Zan's concept artist, as I was curious if Rising Zan had a few more pieces of concept art floating around. Unfortunately, my conversation with him on that subject was a little misinterpreted, but that point hardly matters at the moment. What we did discuss is the future of Rising Zan. Unfortunately, Rising Zan wasn't a commercial success, which is probably obvious since UEP Systems disbanded a few years after, and there hasn't been a sequel since. What was reassuring is that he told me that Makoto Tsunaga, the president of Studio Zan, is still interested in someday creating a sequel. It will probably be a long way off because, as Shimizu explained it, mobile cellular gaming is currently Japan's most popular gaming market. And console gaming as well, it's not doing as great. So Studio Zan currently develops mobile games to stay afloat. Again though, it's really cool that Rising Zan may someday get a sequel that it deserves, and I'm very interested to see how developers would handle a sequel. As for the concept art, I came across something very interesting. It's kind of funny actually. I bought this little book here on Amazon for about $10, believe it or not. When I first saw the book, I thought it was a poster, and for $10, I thought it would look good on my wall. Don't judge me, it was really late at night and I was tired. But to my surprise, the book came a few weeks later and, well, it was a book. And it was exactly what I was looking for. The book itself is a strategy guide jam-packed with concept art and pictures of the developers. I can't even find mention of the book anywhere except on Amazon. I've decided to step out on a limb here and upload pictures of the whole book in maybe a PDF or on a WordPress website. I don't know Japanese, so I can't translate any of it, but maybe someone can help me out if they have spare time, or knows someone who has spare time. I'd really appreciate it. Anyways, that's basically it. I'm still somewhat in contact with the developers and have some more questions in regards to the game. As well, I'd still love to get an interview going with Atsunori Namba, and maybe that will happen someday. Thank you for watching, and blah blah video comments, I don't care. Hit me up if you're interested in helping translate that strategy guide though. My next video may or may not have more PS1 swordplay action. Or it might have lesbians.